Hello guys, welcome to another J for JavaScript tutorial. It's been 3 weeks, but we are back in this two-part series of the to-do list. In part one, we looked at how we implemented the HTML and CSS. If you haven't watched that, I recommend you do so. In this part, we are simply going to implement the JavaScript and give life to our to-do list. So let's go through the features we're going to implement in this to-do list. So we're going to listen for events in our input and render the list item on the page. As you can see, we'll also listen for events on our list items to mark if we're completed with it or uncheck. We can also delete as well. Another cool feature we've added is local storage. As you can see, if we add a list in our item, open our DevTools under application, you'll see that we have stored our list item in a key value pair object, as you can see right here. So if we refresh, you'll still find your list on the page. As you can see, so all these are things we are going to look at in this video. So if you're excited, like and subscribe, and let's get started. Just before we start, you can clone our repo and get started and follow through, or simply watch what we did in part one. Another thing, this is what we have currently done so far. As you can see, there's no JavaScript in it and it does nothing but simply refresh. All right, let's get started. So let's carefully break down what we are going to do in this application. So first we want to define an empty to-do array, which is going to store all our list items. Then we want to capture the text we write in our input, right? What happens when we capture the text? We want to now submit it. We want to submit it and render it on the page for us to see. And then once we're finished rendering, we want to perform some CRUD options. CRUD meaning create, read, update, and delete, right? So we want to mimic some CRUD options or to-do list. So we want to mark our list items as complete. We also want to delete them, right? So we want to mark them as complete, want to delete them, as we can do here. So we want to listen to the text, render it on the page, perform some CRUD options like mark it as complete or unmark it. Then we want to delete it, and finally we want to store it in the local storage. And that's about it. So as you can see, we've broken down what we're going to do. We're going to first create an empty array that stores all our list items, capture our text input, render the list items on the page, perform some CRUD options like marking the lists complete and deleting them, and then finally storing all these list items in the local storage to persist our data, so that even though we refresh, we still find our data on the browser or in the app. So all these are going to sharpen our JavaScript tools, our functions, local storage knowledge, DOM methods. So if you've watched my previous videos on functions, arrays, data types, this is going to sharpen your skills further. How do we use ES6 functions, and all that kind of stuff. So I hope this is really going to help you out on this and hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, let's start with the to-do list item, or rather array. So let's start with declaring our variable of our empty array. Now this is where we'll push all our items into this array. If you remember one of our push methods, array methods push is one of them. So this is where we'll push all our arrays in, all our items in this array whenever we submit from our text input. Next, let us declare the variable, the button, variable, which is this add button. So if we go back to our HTML and look for our button, you can see that we assigned it an ID of add right here. So we simply use a query selector to capture to capture the ID of our button. Notice we're using ES6 syntax, the let keywords, and later we use the const keywords rather than the var keywords we're used to in ES5. Again, use the DOM method, the document. That's our add right there. So let's create a function that captures our text and pushes the text into our to-do item array we declared here. Text is going to be our parameter we're looking for in the input field. And to-do is a kind of an object we're going to pass to our array. And it has our text. Checked by default will be false. So all our to-do items will be unchecked by default, and unless you check it yourself when you click on marked, and you get to see that line through you see here in the demo. This. So by default it will be unchecked. And then finally we're going to pass it an ID, a unique ID that is unique to all items, and the best ID we can come up with is a det. This will help us to delete items easily and mark them completed or uncheck them based on their IDs, since that's the differentiator. We call our to-do items, and then we use the array method push our to-do. We're going to first console log this before we render it on the page. But this is not yet done. Right now, let's look at the form and try to add an event listener on this plus right here and push, or yes, push the text we have here into this to do items. So let's create a function that targets the form we have in our HTML. This is our form right here, and we gave it a class name of JS form. So in our form, we're going to give it an event listener of click. When someone clicks on the add button, add the item to the array. Please take note that these spellings should be the same. If you mistake the spelling, it will not work. So please take clear notice on that. So let's create our function and variable of the form. Now we want to add an event listener. So what we've done here is simply added an event listener type of submit, and the E simply means event. And what the e.prevent vote means or helps us with, it prevents the page from reloading whenever you click the plus button, as you can see right now. So we have added that, so that will help us prevent the page on reloading whenever we click the add list item. Okay, now that we're done with adding the event listener, let's look at how we capture the text input. And that's simple. We also simply create a variable for it and add a query selector and pick up the ID we assigned to that input. So if we go back to our HTML and look for our input, you notice that we assigned it our JS to input. So simply come back to our JS, and that's it. We now have the input, the ID. We have now the class ID of input. Now let's assign it to our text we declared already up above in the add to do function. Trim, remember, removes any white space. Okay, now that we have the text, we want to give it some conditions, right? If conditions. So we want to say that if the text is empty, if the text is not empty and there's a text or there's something in it and someone presses on the plus button, well, push the list to the to-do list item. If it's empty, prompt up something like please type something, or this should not be empty, something like that really. And after, we want to clear the text. You don't want to leave your to-do items on the text input. I'm going to show you how what that means. So let's create a simple if condition here. So we have a simple condition here. It's saying that if the text in our input here is not empty, well and good, push the text to the to-do item list, right? So let's test that out. But just before we test it out, let's connect our script file to our HTML. And if you're using a script tag above, simply remember to use defer. That simply means your JavaScript file loads with your HTML and CSS content in parallel when your browser is loading, just in case you want to put it above. So let's put it above in this example. So our script is connected with our HTML and our console is open right here. So let's try adding a to-do list and we see what happens. As you can see right now in our console, we have an array, and in our array, we have an object that has our text, our check, and our ID, that is the time, which we declared right here. But notice something, our learn.js is still there. It hasn't cleared. So how do we do that? Simply how we do that is reassign our input value to an empty string after submitting. And we do that simply doing this. As simple as that. Now, if we try to add it on a list again and submit, look, the text disappears and we have our item in the to-do item array right here. So I hope this is making sense. We have declared our to-do items array, given our written a function that adds our text in the input and pushes them to the to-do list array. As you can see right here, this is what we get. We push it to the array, and this is the form that has our submit, our event listener. When you press this, get the input you've got in the text input, trim off any spaces, and then simply push it back to the to-do item. Another minor feature you can add if you want it is the focus DOM method. And what this simply does, it focuses on the element that you want, your HTML element. So once we submit our new item, notice it focuses on the input again for us to type in more items, and so it's more of a good user experience and intuitive for users to know that, oh, okay, I can add more items if I wanted. But if you don't want, you can remove it, and the difference will be minimal, but the focus really helps the user to really focus on what's important. So the input field is really important for us, and this is where everything matters. This is where our users type in there to do items. So this is a minor feature you can add in. Okay, and just before we start rendering these list items on the page, let's add an else condition that if someone tries to press the add button, let's prompt the user to type something in that input text if there's nothing. So if the user attempts to click the add button without typing anything, he will get an alert telling them to please type something. Awesome. All right. Now let's see how we can render the to-do list items in our array on the screen or on the app. So let's look at that. So in order for us to render the to-do items list items on the app on the page, the certain steps we have to do for that to happen. So first we will select the element with the class of the JS to-do list, which if we look in our HTML and look closely to our list here, we see that this is where our class is seated, the JS to-do list. That's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to first select the element with that class. Then two, we'll check if the item is checked or not again, depending on what we have in our to-do object. Then we'll go on to create a node and assign it list element. And then we'll set a class attribute and then a data key attribute to the ID, and then set content in the node where we'll use the classes we have already predefined in our CSS in our node, and then finally append the element to our last child. That sounds confusing right now, but it's all going to be clear as we code this right now. So hopefully it becomes much clearer as we code along the way. So first, let us select the element with that class of the to-do list. Of course, we create the function first. Now we're going to pass the to-do object as our only parameter in this function. That's done. We have finished selecting the class, the element with the class of today's to-do list. Next, let's check if our strings will either be checked, but by default we know every string will be checked by default. Done is a property we have in our CSS, which we'll see later. Now next, let's create a node and assign a list item to the node. And how we're going to do that, we're going to simply use the DOM method of create element. And it's as simple as that. Now next, what we have to do is assign a class attribute to our node. Here we use the set attribute method. Now you might be wondering, why is this to do item coming from? If we look at our styles.css, we see that we have a class, right, with the to do item. So this is what we want to assign our node element, and which we have done using the set attribute method. As you can see, we've created a node, assigned it to a list, and now we're giving it the class of to do item, which has the following properties of flex grow, margin left, font size, which we'll all play around with when you see it on the screen. Now let's set a data key attribute to the node as well. This will come in hand when we are going to delete and going to mark the items complete or incomplete. So for now, we don't need it right now, but in later when we implement the delete and up and mark items as complete, this will come in handy. So we have set the ID to the node as well. Now let's assemble everything in to our node using the inner HTML. We're simply assembling the input and giving it the elements necessary, as you will see when we render them on the page. Let's create a span for it. So simply an input, our label that has our ID, and as I said, you want to be careful. You're naming them exactly as you have them in your CSS. So if you look through, we have our to do item, we have our done, we have our tick, we have our delete to do. So we are assigning our classes we did in part one to our node list here right now in our HTML. We are simply assigning them the CSS styles we already wrote in the CSS file here. So nothing complicated really. Simple HTML within the inner HTML list. And then finally, let's append the node the to the element, to the list variable. Simply list, and let's check it out. So don't forget to call it in our function here. You can remove the consoles, no longer needed. Okay, let's try it out. And we have an error. Type error not set attribute. Okay, so errors happened. You have to always be careful, as I've been telling you. So we have an error telling us that set attribute is not a function. That's probably my spelling is wrong. So if we correct this, we should have no problem if we try again. Beautiful. As you can see, we have successfully rendered our to-do item on the page. And as you can see, this class morphism, as I talked about in part one, when we look at our CSS right here, you get to see the background, then this simple blur, the box shadow that gives it this nice looking touch to it. Okay, so let's go through what we have done. So at first thing, we created a function that accepted the to do object as the only parameter. Then we created a list. We selected the element with the JS to do list. Then we said if it's not checked, which is by default, return an empty string. As you can see, by default our object has checked value of false, so it brings back our string that is by default unchecked. We'll look at the done class element when we are looking at marking them as complete, but for now, that is it. Then we created a node, and inside that node, we assigned a list. So if you really want to visualize this, let's use our crucial tool I talked about last time, HTML tree generator. If you look at it right now and look at our UL, it now has a list because we created a node and attached it to the UL. Now it has this input, it has this label, it has this span, and it has this button. Everything we wrote in our node, in our inner HTML using JavaScript, using JavaScript. Everything is right here in the tree, and it's so amazing. I definitely recommend you use this tool. It really lets you see your application in a tree like structure and in a relatable way, showing you the relationships between your elements. So after that, we set the class attribute of to item, and then we set the attribute to that to do ID, which we say this will come in hand when we want to delete items or mark them complete. Then we then finally input our elements in the node the way we wanted them to appear. And that is what we have here. I hope this made sense. And if it didn't, you can try watching it again. You can ask us in our Slack community, J for JavaScript, and I'll do my best to explain it to you. Now, let's see what to do next. So we have successfully rendered our list items on the page. Now let's try marking them done. As you can see, nothing works currently. So that's the next thing we're going to look at. So we're going to do this in 3 simple steps. First, we are going to add an event listener that listens for a click event on the checkbox. Then we create a toggle function for the checkbox that passes our key we assigned to our checkbox in this function. And then finally, we replace our node with the updated node of the checked or unchecked item. Okay. And once we do this, it will pretty much be the same with our delete function. So us doing this, you'll pretty much see the same pattern with the delete function later on after us marking tasks incomplete or complete. So let's start with the event we're going to add in our container. So let's start by selecting the whole list. Now let's add an event listener. Now you want to be careful if you decide to name your event E, make sure it's consistent throughout your code. If you name it event, then make sure it's event throughout your code. Now we're going to call our function that we're going to define above. So let's explain what we are doing here. So first we selected our list that contains the checkbox. If we go back to our HTML and see here, right here, we selected the whole container, the UL element that contains our input and our checkboxes. Then what happens after is we add an event listener that listens for a class that listens for the 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 checklist items. If it contains, if it's done, then pass the JSTIC element or design to the checklist. And once we have that, let's create a variable and store the targeted or the value of that and add it to the parent element and then send it back to, in this case, the function, which our function in this case will call the render to do items that has that particular ID passed to the item key. So if that's still confusing, we are about to see that in action. But right now, we have successfully selected our list, added an event listener, passed the items, the styles to the parent element, and down to the function, which is our step 2, and we're going to create in a moment. Okay, now let's copy this, or rather cut it. Now, just below our render, our add to do function, this is where we're going to create our toggle down function. So first, we are going to pass our key we got in the toggle, then locate the item using the find index array method. Now this is where we're going to find the index of that particular element in the array. And to do that, we use the find index method. You can read more about that if you want to know what it does, but simply the first it locates the index of an array element in the array. And as you can see, VS Code also gives us some pretty helpful descriptions. As you can see, it returns the index of the first element in the array where predicate is true and -1 is otherwise. So VS Code also helps in that to give you basic understanding, and most of its references goes back to the Mozilla docs. Equals the number of the key. Okay, so now that we have the key, how do we locate it? Well, we use the bracket notations. That index, and now we're going to toggle the item. Simple as that. This simply means not equal to. So it always goes true and false. Click true, false, true, false, true, false. So we have identified the index of that key, and now we have located the property using the array bracket notation, and now passed the condition of checked, right? If it's checked, uh, you mark it as done, pass the JS tick. If it's not checked, remove the JS tick, go back to false generally the first time when you add an item to the list. And now, the last but not least, let's call the render to do function as well. This time, with the index. So now that we have that, let's see what we get in our app. Oh, something is happening. We don't see anything. I was rather on the wrong app. Back to our main app here. So as you can see, now if we try toggling, as you can see, it works great, but something is happening. It's duplicating itself. So that means that instead of the node replacing or updating the tree, it just adds it on top of the other. So you get these duplicates, and we don't want that. We want our nodes to update when we check and uncheck and uncheck. So let's fix that. And we simply come in our render to do app and first select our to do the data key we pass to the to do item. While we're getting this data key is the one we passed in our collection right here in the inner HTML. Right here, as you can see, we set attribute of data key to do.id. So after doing that, we now simply create a condition that if the node exists, well, update it or replace it. So if our item exists, well, replace it. Otherwise, just add it to the list. Okay, let's test it out now and see. We're having a problem. Let's see what's the problem. Okay, found the problem. We should add quotes here, and we should be good to go if I'm not wrong. Nice. Let's try it out. Lovely. As you can see now, it replaces the item if it's already on the list, and if it's not there, as you can see, just render a new one. Nice. Okay. Now that we have seen how to mark items as complete and uncheck them, now let's see how we can delete them. As I said, once you get the hang of marking them as complete, the delete function is pretty much the same. All we have to do is add it in our function down here at the bottom and create a function or to delete the items, and that's it. So let's look into how we're going to do that. So as I said, it's pretty much the same, similar to our markers complete. So what we're going to do, simply get this condition, the items, just replace this with just, and these are the class we gave in the inner HTML. As you can see, just delete do the same for the JSTick. So this is where we're getting the classes from. So if it exists, if this class exists, well, do the following: pass it to our event, set the data, the key, and pass it down to our function, which this time we'll call it and again go above and just below the toggle down function, that's where we're going to put our delete function right here. So the delete function will be similar to the toggle down. The only difference will be us creating an object within the delete function, setting the item to true, deleted to true, and then filtering out that particular item you are selecting on that icon. Pretty much the same here. Now this is where we create the object. We set the deleted to true. Now you want to make sure you keep your items in the array the same shape of your array without altering the whole array. And using spread operators help us do that. And now to remove our item, we're simply going to use the filter method. simply call the render to do. So if the item is not equal to the key, then remove it. So let's test it out and see. This one works. Well, something is not working. Let's find out why. We had forgotten to update the render to do itself. So in the render to do, let's add our delete if condition. Okay, so let's try it out. Check that. And still failing. We had forgotten to pass the key. Let's try now and again and see. Good. And now you can see we can now mark things as complete. Mark them as complete, unmark them, delete them, and great. So one more thing, and that is to store our items in the local storage so that our data is persisted in the browser, so that even though you refresh, you still find them there, just like in our CodePen application here. As you can see, the data is persisted, and even though we refresh, we still find the same item on the app. So this is the same thing we want to do for our build right here. So let's see how we start with that. So adding local storage into our app is not that difficult. So by that, we're going to first set items into the local storage. By that, we're going to get the keys, our do items, transfer them into strings, because local storage only stores our data as strings. So let's start by simply calling the local storage method in our render to do method, a function, sorry. And this is how we do it. So the JSON.stringify is going to convert our data to strings. And now the set item simply stores the data in our local storage. So if we check in our DevTools, F12, or right click and click on inspect under our local storage. Now if we type in our list item, you see that our set method has done just that. It just it has got our item and stored it into a local storage, the browser's local storage, as you can see right here, with our key and value pair, sort of an object like structure. So, and that's it. But the problem with this is, yes, we know that it's stored in the local storage, but it's not persistent on our page. Like, it disappears, even though we know that it's in the local storage. So one way to do that is simply using the get item. We fetch the data in the local storage, then make sure it always loads when the page is loaded, or when the DOM per se is loaded on our app. So with that, we're going to just simply use the DOM content loaded method to get the items in a local storage and display them on the application. Okay. So this event listener is going to listen for a load in our app, right? So we are listening for a DOM load content. When our DOM reloads, that's when we want to fetch or get the items, then display them on the page. And the method, the event listener for that, it's DOM is DOM content loaded. What items are we getting? We're getting the to do refs item. That's where we stored our information in that key value. So the JSON.parse always or converts the string data we have on our web server or in our storage back to the object. As you can see, our data in the local storage is a key value pair object strike like structure, but it's stored in a string format. So if you want to get that information back, we use the JSON.parse to convert it right back in the object, the way we sent it at the first in the first the first place. So now we're going to iterate through our object using the for each loop. And if we've done everything correctly, this should be working. As you can see, I think we are already seeing the working product. Our LAN is still on even after it has been loaded. Beautiful. So if we check it complete, our checked will turn to true, as you can see, and to keep all that with the ID, with the text and everything in it. And that's how we store our information in the local storage. If we did this, still do the same thing, nothing will still show because it will revert back to an empty array in the local storage. So that's it, and we have come to an end of our amazing tutorial. We have looked at the JavaScript. We have seen how we add event listeners on the click, on the add icon. We've seen how we mark items complete, uncheck them, delete them. We have performed some amazing CRUD options, or rather operations. And again, if you haven't understood much about anything in this tutorial, I recommend you watch it again or simply ask us in our Slack community, J for JavaScript, and we'll be more than glad to help you out. So that's about it. Hope you had fun. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and keep learning. All right. Thank you. See you in the next one. But just before I go, we had totally forgotten to submit our changes to GitHub. So let's do just that. As you can see, you should be a pro by now using GitHub because we have done this countless times. You know how to commit, create pull requests, and that kind of stuff. You know how to merge, you know how to pull. And that's it. Hope to see you in another tutorial. Bye bye.